So, folks, for much of this year, 2025, you've heard us here on AgriView and in various platforms talking about how excellent a year this has been for South African agriculture. And that is true because if you look at a couple of the major crops that we produce in this country, the harvest has been excellent. I'm looking now in front of me on the 2024-25 production season estimates that were revised at the end of September by the Crop Estimate Committee. And they came out, they say, hey, hold on, we're not only just having a fairly good season, we have an excellent season. And they lifted our summer grains and oilseeds by 2%. And they are telling us now that we have about 19.9 million tons of our crops. And you think about that from a year-on-year basis, is pretty much a major jump of about 28% year on year. So that just tells you then that things are looking reasonably well. And when we talk about the summer grains and oilseeds, some people that follow this channel know we've explained this. We mean all of maize, white maize, yellow maize, soybeans, sunflower seed, groundnuts, sorghum, you name it. Those are all of the major staples in South Africa. But again, we are not a country that just produces only grains. This optimism is the same thing that we continue to see on the revised data that is coming out of various fruits, citrus, various deciduous fruits, and also in the wine industry. So indeed, this has been a great year for South African agricultural sector. And I think the growth figures, thinking now about whether this sector is growing or not, the GDP data, for example, a few weeks back, it came out for the second quarter of this year. And it, again, showed that we were still on that positive growth trajectory in South Africa, which mirrors what we are seeing on the ground from all of these output data that are coming out on the various crops. In the second quarter, we learned that this sector actually grew about 2.5% quarter on quarter. And someone may say, okay, 2.5 coming from the first quarter where the sector grew by 18.6% quarter on quarter seasonally adjusted. That is not that much of an optimistic figure, but it is. Because what we learned there was that in our summer grains, the harvest was delayed. And we generally think that the third quarter figures will actually show a jump. And I'm explaining all of these detail and these numbers to again underscore the point that this is an excellent year in South African agriculture. The trade figures say as much. We've discussed that here on AgriView, where we said in the second quarter of this year, South Africa's agricultural exports were at 3.7 billion US dollars, up 10% on year basis. And the exports that went to a whole range of diverse markets. Looking at these numbers then, one can even ask and say, in terms of the sentiment, what are things looking like? And the Agriculture Business Chambers Agribusiness Confidence Index, again, yes, it showed that index declined a little bit between the second quarter to the third quarter, but it was still at somewhere at number 63. What does 63 mean in this index? The sentiment is measured from 0 to 100. And of course, there's a benchmark point which is at 50. And when it drops below 50, that's what we would call a contraction, or we begin to worry that there is pessimism in the sector. If it is above 50, there's optimism. Again, the number that is 63 then speaks to that optimism that is still there in the South African agricultural sector. And I think then when one hears all of these numbers, looking at all of these movements, you say, okay, then the South African agricultural sector is doing well. There is no problem within this farming sector. And I would say, yes, to a certain extent, that's what things are. At the overall national level, this is a fairly good year for South African agriculture. But I think it would be irresponsible of us if we would not acknowledge that there are some challenges. The past week, we were in KZN, depending on when you are watching us on this, but the exact date that we were in KZN, it was at the end of September. We went to KwaZulu-Natal to meet with a whole range of agribusinesses, farmer representatives, and many people. And we were discussing with them about a range of things pertaining to agricultural sector, the agricultural conditions. which is a positive picture that I've just explained to you, as well as some of the friction related to trade-related matters. I'm thinking here now the export diversification stuff that the Department of Trade and Industry has been talking about, and also the president has alluded to. And of course, our point of view regarding trade is that South Africa, the US, we are at risk, of course, there. But the US, let's remember, is about 4% of our overall agricultural exports. But we still need to work on retaining those markets. Now that there's a lack of clarity, at least by the time we're recording this video, about AGOA, it does also mean then that in the absence of AGOA, you would have certain tariff addition on top of the 30% tariffs that we face in the US, further complicating our market access and the competitiveness of our products in the US market. But the bigger point about export diversification is the one that we embrace, is the one that we have talked about in the previous segments of this podcast. And our viewpoint was that the Department of Trade and Industry need to assess whether we have the capacity for South Africa to engage a whole range of countries. And yes, in the early 2000s, we made great strides as a country, opening up various markets to an extent that today we have these markets that are fairly diverse. Half of our exports to the African continent, 19% to the EU, over 24% to the Middle East and Asia, Americas, and a whole range of markets. But if we want to open new markets while retaining the current ones that we have, we must have people then that will go together with business and talk about maintaining these markets and strengthening the relationship that we already have with some of these countries. While at the same time, we have another group of people that will be targeting Asia, another group of people that target the Middle East, another group of people that see whether there are some of the things that we could still do in the Americas. So all of that needs trade negotiators, which is why I often raise the point about whether we have the capacity. And yes, we may have to a certain extent, but my honest point is that we need to beef up the capacity and get more people. And this is also an area where, of course, then a reprioritization of budgets to increase that capacity, bringing in the private sector where it's needed, as well as the academics. Because at the end of the day, you do need to have people that are impartial when you're thinking about trade aspect. Because if you are representing a certain organization, ultimately, you are representing the interest of the organization that you have. But if you are sitting as a representative of a country, you are at a position where you would be able to make trade-offs. And the reason I raise this is because for a long time in South Africa, we existed in a world where people were open on taking our products. But right now, other countries are looking to diversify just like we are, which means then that ensuring that there are necessary trade-offs and choices that will be made and mapping up the sensitive sectors and the sectors that one could be able to make some bit of trade-off and accommodate other countries. Because reciprocity is a game of trade. And I think at this time around, many people are looking for free trade agreements. And that's what South Africa will need also to embrace, and not some piecemeal partnerships for particular sectors, but really robust and ambitious trade agreements. That's the point that much of our conversation in KZN also reflected on. But I'm raising KZN not to tell you what we were discussing about in KZN, but to raise another issue that in the early start of this podcast, we did talk about it, and that is the animal health issue. Because when we finish talking in KZN, we, of course, have a moment where we reflect, we hear what are the issues from people on the ground. And the key point that was raised by a number of farmers in KZN was that foot and mouth disease continued to be a major thing, especially for the dairy industry in that province. And the banks and other financial organizations that were sitting in the room, they told us about the numbers and the difficulties and the scale of this challenge to a number of their clients. This brings me back then to the point to say, while in South Africa, at the end of July, the Department of Agriculture gathered many people, and we talked about the foot and mouth disease in Daba, where the minister mapped up a team of people that needs to work on saying, what does South Africa do to get out of this challenge? That is important. And while that has already been done, it doesn't mean that we have actually solved the problem in South Africa. We continue to have this challenge in many of the communities. So when we talk about how excellent of a year that we've had in agriculture. There are other people that look at us, say, look, we see all of these beautiful pictures that you are talking about on the crops, but I'm a dairy farmer sitting in the Midlands in KZN, and I'm not seeing this in my financials. So the year and the growth that we are talking about in South African agriculture is actually an uneven growth. We are growing, we are seeing an excellent recovery, but it's an uneven recovery. And I'm using the word recovery because the previous year was very difficult. We had the drought and many other challenges that negatively affected the sector. And now we are talking about rainfall. And some people that are not close observers of agriculture could say, what are some of these other farmers talking about? Because we are reading, we are looking at the data, and the sector is growing, the jobs numbers are holding up. But those people, they will be talking about, in part, the diseases that we're still facing as a country. And I think this goes back to, again, saying strengthening our capacity on biosecurity, both on controls and monitoring of the spread of the disease, and making all measures to control this and putting all of those measures in place is one thing, and that we need to accelerate. And I know that there's a couple of private sector players that are doing this work. Red Meat Industry Service and many others are involved in this work, but I think they need to be supported and they need to continue with that work and continue with it with speed, because there are a number of communities that still struggle. And people also raise the issue of the vaccines to say, yes, we talk that we have the vaccine we procure from Botswana, but those vaccines don't last that much. You have, after certain few months, still again think about vaccinating and all of this kind of stuff, which then brings us back to the same point of saying South Africa really needs to move with speed on investing on the vaccine manufacturing and tap into the private sector capabilities that are in there. Because it's not like we are a country that doesn't have capacity to produce. There are people in the private sector that do this stuff. And I think that the Department of Agriculture has to move with speed, with ambition, with intention on interacting with all of those players and say, what can we realistically do? It's a one thing to have Indaba, and it's important because it gets all of us in a room. We all get to have a sense and appreciation of the urgency of the matter, and people get to raise their challenges and observations from their communities. But I think it needs to move then to a smaller team that is more targeted and dealing with the issue of vaccine manufacturing, but generally strengthening South Africa's biosecurity. Because the point about the exports, if we don't resolve the biosecurity challenges, we will not really succeed and go a long way on those trade agreements. We may strike the trade agreements, people lower tariffs, and they say, bring the products when it's time for phytosanitary clearance. And then it turns out that we have some of the issues that people don't desire in their markets. And then still, we will be back in square one. There will be an agreement, but there will be very few products that get to benefit on that, which is why then this is important. And in KZN, we heard a lot from an animal perspective, but I think that's the same energy that needs to be moved towards the plant health side. So overall, really the core point we wanted to put on AgriView in here is to underscore that the sector is growing, but this is an uneven recovery. And there's still all of these pain points. And either you are in government or in private sector, that collaborative approach is something that we need to embrace, because ultimately, this is an important sector of the economy and it brings so much value in rural South Africa. So we all want to see agriculture growing. And with that, folks, let me stop there. And again, we appreciate your support and encourage you to share all of these clips in your networks as widely as you can. And we are thankful that you continue to watch this channel. Subscribe if this is your first time encountering us. Thanks so very much for watching.